program for graduate studies at Charles Darwin University. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. And yes, we are in a special Touchstone Endings session. How to know it is time to quit a PhD. Some fascinating research and seriously depressing materials emerged in the construction of this session, but this is a moment of pause for us, as so many of the sessions in our endings portfolio have become. And that is a depressing, difficult moment for us because so many students leave. And there is research from the United States that confirms that 50% of students that start a PhD do not finish it. Therefore, how can we help our students understand if it is time to end their enrolment or when they really should push on and finish it? Tough question. The best way I know how to determine the difference is through an emotional exercise, and we'll get to that in a second. But before we go to emotion, let's present a fact. The intellectual ability of the students that graduate from a PhD and the students that quit a PhD before examination is the same. So in other words, all this stuff about someone not being bright enough to do a PhD is nonsense. The attritors and the completers have the same intellectual ability. So the completion of a PhD or the desire to leave has nothing to do with intelligence. Okay, there's my fact. Now let's move to my emotional exercise. So in offices like mine, I see students on the worst day of their lives and the best day of their lives. And I have students who ask me on a daily basis, should I quit my PhD? So I give them an exercise in my office, and what happens is as follows. I look at them and I say, let's visualise something. Let's visualise something. Right now, I am taking your PhD away from you. Now, feel that. Feel that. And then tell me what you're feeling. Okay, now if a student is feeling relieved, so I've taken the PhD away from you, and they're feeling relieved, then that's the person that should leave a PhD program. If a student is teary, really upset, feeling bereft, then the chances are that student should continue. If a student is just bathed with relief that it's over, then let them leave the PhD because it's just not worth it. If a student is really upset at the idea of leaving and it's visceral, then okay, that student should probably stay and we have to come up with new strategies. But the rest of this Touchstone session emerges for our supervisors who are supervising a student who thinks they should quit. So let's drill down and see what the research tells us, knowing that leaving a PhD has nothing to do with a student's intellectual level or ability. So firstly, gain some perspective. A PhD is just a PhD. It's a qualification, it's not cancer, it's not global warming, it's not the drought in regional Australia. As I've said so often, a student is not a qualification. A student is not a student's PhD. A student's identity is not a degree. So put the qualification into perspective. If the thesis is torturing a student on a daily basis, so there's no highs, there's no lows, then it's time to leave. 2. Does a student need the PhD to enable their future career? This is an important question, and it's really important that we get real here. But also, where I get staunch and remind people is that it is a qualification. And you know what? You have to finish it. You have to finish it. But you've got to ask, is this qualification of use to the student to gain an array of jobs, either inside or outside the university? So will they need it? Now, if that student wants a job in a university as an academic, then they're going to need that qualification. I don't shortlist anyone for the most junior of academic jobs in a university without a PhD. Full stop. So getting the PhD is important as the foundation for an academic career. Remember that most PhD students don't end up working in universities now. We're running at about 60-40. 40% remain in universities and become academics or professional staff, but about 60% work outside of universities. But if a student wants to be an academic, then they are going to need a PhD. Therefore, put the PhD in a clear frame for them. Don't make it the student's life work. It is the worst research project they will ever do, not the best. Treat it like a job they have to complete and get them to finish it. So, the PhD sometimes makes a student unhappy. But you know what? Work isn't always pleasant. Mostly it isn't pleasant. And that's why it's called work. So make sure a student has a perspective on that, knowing it is hard and it requires effort and struggle every day. If it's a matter of grunting through it and finishing it to achieve career goals, then they need to do that. And we need to explain to the students why they need to do it. It's about expectations management. If a student thought it was going to be like chasing rainbows, then students' expectations were wrong at the start. It's about recalibrating students' expectations, understanding what is required to be an academic, and finishing that thesis. 3. Is the student too emotionally invested in the doctorate? Getting feelings hurt is not a reason to quit a PhD. A student's supervisor or a student's fellow students' peers, if they're rude to a student, if they ignore a student, that is not a reason to quit a PhD. Life is dreadful most of the time. PhD is part of life. If a student needs it for a job, treat it like a job. Don't expect it to be a love affair. A student has a responsibility, so they have to finish it. So, if it's all getting a bit too much, then something has to change. And that may be changing a student's expectation, changing a student's mindset, sharpening a student's project, changing a student's supervisory team. So go hard. If someone is racially, sexually or socially vilifying a student, that is illegal. But it's also a contravention of university policy. So don't quit. Change what a student can change and finish quickly to move a student to their next stage. Don't romanticise the doctorate, don't romanticise academic life, don't romanticise the workforce more generally. We live in ruthless, tough, nasty, backbiting and ego-driven times, and the PhD is certainly part of these difficult times. And remember when Darwin talked about the survival of the fittest, it was not the survival of the people who do CrossFit. It was the survival of the species that could adapt. Those that could adapt survived and thrived. So if a student has a narrative about how they thought their life would be, I suppose we all have that, and the stuff in the PhD is challenging that narrative, then they've got an option. They either leave the program or they change their life narrative. The PhD does not exist to make a student happy. It exists as a bridge in a student's life to move them to a different place and space. 4. Do the students fixate on an end point? I always say begin with the end in mind, but it is important that 3 months in, 6 months in, 18 months into a candidature, a student doesn't judge their work by a finished thesis and the standards required there. And one of the reasons we have milestones and annual reports is so that students assess their progress and they have, these ways of engaging with how are they doing on the way through. Now, Oasis named an album, and I liked it, to be honest, and their album was Be Here Now. And I've always thought that's a bit of a maxim for life. Being in the present of a student's thesis is crucial. Judge the now, not where the student thinks they should be, and we judge them now and not by the criteria of a completed thesis. 5. Be aware that the midpoint is the danger point. One of the reasons that we spend a lot of time with students in their mid-candidature and why that period is the most complex and intricate. And we often see students shaking, crying, shouting their way through all sorts of milestone events and talks, is that it is the crisis point where they're working out whether or not they're going to continue. So if a student is feeling shaky in the mid-candidature, that is actually normal. A student is halfway down the tunnel. They've already invested a lot, but they also know there is a long way to go. So know that this is a point of anxiety for everyone and expect it. Before we get into that mid-candidature, as a supervisor, let's just check the fundamentals are right, the students are working towards milestones, a student's expectations are clear, and a student has a separation from their life. So they know here is my thesis and here is my life, and they are different. And that will allow us all to take a breath and keep moving. 6, a student loses motivation. This is a really serious issue for many students. And it is important that a student is really clear on their motivations from the start. And remember, I get my students to list 10 motivations in their first meeting. So why are you here? And we don't stop until they have 10. But motivations are not enough to get a student through the dark night of a PhD. Particularly if a student has just lost interest in the research, there's no reason to get up in the morning. If a student finds themselves mentally checked out, seen a lot of those as Dean. And if a student is enrolled in a PhD, but they haven't really enrolled in a PhD in their head, that is, it's not something they think about every day, then really it is time to leave. This is not a question of motivation really, but focus, commitment and interest. 7, recognise that supervision may be only part of the problem. Students that blame their supervisor or advisor for all sorts of problems, so when in doubt, it's the supervisor's fault, those students are very difficult to help. We all know the cliche, it is a student's thesis. It is a student's thesis. It's not the supervisor's thesis. And remember that on those days, most academics, most of us, are just sort of struggling to just survive. We're struggling to hold on to our own jobs, and 60, 80, 100-hour weeks are common. So a student supervisor may not be helping a student terribly much, but blaming the supervisor may also be blocking a student from making a clear decision. Yes, absolutely, we can change a student's supervisor, but recognise that if a student hasn't sorted themselves out, so this is stuff like, why are they doing the thesis? What is their level of commitment? Are they dogged? Are their expectations in check? Then unless this stuff's in place, no supervisor will be able to help that student. So check if a student is using the supervisor, using us, as an excuse for bigger issues. Then, okay, change supervisors, but be aware that the same problems may reappear, and therefore this issue has nothing to do with the supervisor. It is to do with the student, and it may be therefore time to leave the program. 8, is a student's project sound? One of the reasons we ensure in the Australian system that students do a meaningful confirmation of candidature where a student is assessed and the project is assessed is so that we can end a bad situation early. The literature shows that one of the reasons that students leave a PhD, particularly at the midpoint, is that the research questions or the topic or the scope and scale of the thesis are just not working. These problems should have been picked up much earlier, and if they are not, then the project has problems and they're only going to get worse. Candidates leave the PhD because the topic just won't cut it. And there are ways to intervene, to create that scope and scale again, to slice the research literature in a different way, refocus the questions. But if there is a problem in a student's thesis that was not picked up early, then that's another reason it may be time to leave the PhD. So to avoid this situation, make sure that our students' focus is absolutely solid at the start. What are the research questions? What is the literature? What is the theory? Make it tight, make it sharp. Tight and sharp theses finish, baggy and ill-focused theses are not finished. 9. Take a leave of absence first. Now, I never recommend a leave of absence or an intermission or a suspension because I want students to deal with issues rather than kick them to touch. But if a student wants the final guarantee that this is the right course of action, then take a leave of absence for 6 weeks. If a student simply feels better being away, then that's the student's decision. If a student misses the thesis and again feels sort of energised and refocused with the research, then it is time to rejoin with renewed insight. And yes, 10. Talk with people. If a student is thinking of quitting a PhD, a student is having conversations with themselves in a loop. A student's conversations in a loop are about failure, that they're not good enough, and they'll never finish. It's important that those thoughts are expressed to us, are expressed to supervisors. Most of us can then ask a series of structured questions to move a student out of this thought loop and enable a discussion if a PhD is for the student at this time. But also we strongly recommend the use of counsellors, use of counselling services, work on the problem of the PhD and gain an emotional perspective on it. Talk about it with the student's spouse or friends or family, and they'll listen and they'll offer all sorts of alternatives. Also, work on the student's well-being. Ask the obvious questions. Is the student exercising? Are they eating properly? Is booze becoming a bit of an issue? If a student is on a diet of 3 Cokes and 4 Mars bars a day and the student is not seeing the sun, then obviously they're going to hate the doctorate and they're going to hate themselves. So polish back the problems, work on the fundamentals and see if a renewed perspective emerges for a student. But don't live in the decision about a student quitting a PhD and just sitting in it. We need to talk about it. We need to gain alternative perspectives on it, get professional advice. Don't just sit in the problem. We need to think through the problem because this is a big decision and I never pretty this big decision up for a student. It is a decision that will change the trajectory of a student's life. So they need to do the homework. They need to think about their past. They need to think about their future. But they also have to be here now. What are a student's motivations in the present? Is a student blaming other people? Is that a legitimate blame? And yes, change supervisors if the student thinks that is the problem, but most importantly, gain alternative perspectives and views on that decision. A student is not alone. They must get professional advice and make a professional decision, not an emotional one. Now, quitting a PhD is no shame. It's no embarrassment and it's no one else's business. But the student must earn that decision. Do the homework. Make sure that it's not a bad day, a bad week or a bad month. Make sure that it's not a temporary bump in the road. Make sure it is the end of the road. Remember my old line, beginnings matter, but endings matter more. Make a student's ending matter. Thank you for joining me for this Touchstone session focusing on endings, and please contact me if I can be of any further assistance. Take care. Thank you for listening to Touchstones, our professional development program for graduate studies at Charles Darwin University.